Hey everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Human Element. Today I'm speaking with Tom Cross, Head of Threat Research at GetReal. Tom, thanks for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me on the podcast.
Would you start off by telling us a little bit about your journey so far?
Certainly. I'm maybe an old school hacker. I was in the hacker community in the early 90s, ran a bulletin board system, went to college at Georgia Tech, got a computer engineering degree there, went out to Silicon Valley for a few years. And I kind of say I blew back east in the dot-com dust bowl. And I got a job at Internet Security Systems. ISS was a really interesting company in Atlanta in the early or the mid 90s in that, a lot of us people in the hacker scene were really interested in InfoSec and taking computers apart and figuring out how to do things you weren't supposed to do with them. And all of a sudden it was possible to do that for a living. And there was a startup company in our town that, was building products around this. And so a lot of people that I knew worked there. And so I got a job there maybe in 2003 and went to work for this vulnerability research team called X-Force and worked with some really, really brilliant people there. And we did some very interesting vulnerability research and analysis over the years there. So ISS was bought by IBM in 2006. And I managed to sort of make it another 6 years at IBM in X-Force. And X-Force, is still a thing that IBM has. So that's good to see. And after that, I left there. Before I left, I should say that I was eventually managing the research team. I managed X-Force research for a few years. And then I left and ran detection research at Lancope, which was another Atlanta area security startup. It's a long story, but I ended up sort of rebuilding their security research from scratch at Lancope and really redid a lot of their anomaly detection capabilities in their product. And then I left there. Lancope is now part of Cisco, so it's Cisco Stealthwatch. And I went and founded a company called Drawbridge Networks with a friend of mine in New York City. And we built micro-segmentation technology. We built a really sophisticated product with a very small team in a relatively short period of time. And, we sold that company to a company called Opaque, which was eventually, gobbled up by Fortinet. So there's some aspect of that lives on inside of Fortinet's code bases. Currently, I'm at GetReal's Security. GetReal is a deepfake detection technology company. I think deepfakes are sort of an emerging threat. And so it's an interesting place to be. And again, a lot of really smart people here who are looking at things like image forensics and machine learning. And I bring a threat research sort of angle to the discussion here. So that's a bit about my background.
Awesome. Thank you. So now do I have to question whether you're really you or testing out some deepfake tech?
That's a good question. And, you will never be able to tell.
Unless I buy the product.
No, I mean, since COVID, right? This is an interesting topic, right? That might be relevant to the podcast, and that I have been working remotely with people for at least 10 years. And, when we founded Drawbridge, I was based in Atlanta. Most of our engineering team was based in New York City. And we, developed a really effective set of practices that enabled us to work together remotely. I think one of the reasons that we were effective is because we were doing software engineering. And software engineering is a profession that's attractive to introverts. There are times when you need to seal yourself off from other human beings and to have these really complicated, sort of internal dialogues that are not interrupted by others, not interrupted by meetings. So Paul Graham has this really great essay, it's called Manager Time versus Maker Time. And it talks about the fact that as managers, your job is to interact with people and your life is broken up into these 30-minute chunks. And particularly if you're managing a lot of people, you're constantly in meetings, and it's all about when can I find 30 minutes on my calendar to fit you in, right? And if you're writing software, you got to get into the zone, right? There's often this really complicated mental model that you need to construct that actually gets you productive. And it takes you a while to get into gear. And then you can get a bunch of stuff built. But if a manager descends in and pops a meeting in the middle of your afternoon, right? You have to completely shut down this mental process that you're in the middle of, switch to interacting with people, do that thing for 30 minutes or an hour, and then come back. And it's what task can you get done with the remainder of your day? And so when you're working that way, it's really useful for managers to be cognizant of the fact that they have to structure things so that like they're interacting with these developers, like either at the beginning of the day or at the end of the day, or in some way that's not like just breaking up their time. And being thoughtful about how you structure people's time is incredibly important productivity booster, I think. So we had a really effective way of working remotely, because we were doing software engineering. We didn't need to be in the same room all the time. There were times when we were doing design and architecture work where we would fly to the same location. We would spend a couple of days in front of a whiteboard and we would plan out all kinds of technical work. And then we would go back to our respective locations and we were just doing daily updates. And I can get into more of the weeds about how I manage that team. But, because I've been doing this for so long, like when COVID happened, like there were all these people who like suddenly were forced to work remotely and they hadn't worked remotely before. And back to my comment about software engineering being good for introverts, I think that like there's a different kind of person, like remote work is not good for extroverts. Like they don't like it, right? Where they function on sort of face-to-face interaction with people. And, a lot of like senior leaders in particular tend to be extroverts and they tend to be like very unhappy with a world where they have to interact with people over video conferencing. And they're not necessarily like, I don't think they completely have empathy for like other kinds of people and their way of working, if that makes sense. And so you see all these RTO things happening now where COVID's over and they want, these senior leaders want everyone back in the office because the senior leaders operate on meetings all the time. And that's what they think the business is. And the business is in fact me hiding from people so I can get work done. Right. But anyway, yeah, COVID was not a difficult transition for me because I've been used to managing remote teams for a very long time, but it has really changed work culture. I think like there is this long-term permanent shift where, people are much more comfortable working remotely now. They realize they can do it productively in some cases. They've learned how to do it effectively, but it's created this new problem, which is, people are hiring people that they've never met. They've never met them in person. They're giving them a job, so now we have threat actors slipping into that stream and getting employed and that they're using a fake identity. And so now we have a new computer security problem where, human beings are actually getting employed and deep fake technology plays into that, of course, like, cause you can easily disguise your identity. So, sure, you have no idea who I am. Perhaps many of the people I've worked with over the years don't know if I'm real, but it's interesting. And that's why I'm working on this problem, right?
Those are the big ones. Yeah. I mean, the thing that resonated with me the hardest right there was I remember, early 2000s talking about, how it takes half an hour to get a developer to reload state so you can get into the zone. Like best case after an interrupt, it's a half hour ramp up before you can get into the zone and code. It's a kind of hard to remind myself. It's like, yes, meetings are interrupts to people who aren't responsible for meetings.
Hopefully a lot of technical leaders have a past where they were hands on keyboard. And what I challenge you to do is think about what it would take for you to sit down and actually do something technically productive if you're like 100% managing people, and what a gear shift that is, because it can be just as bad of a gear shift for somebody that's doing it to come off a meeting and get back into the right mindset and remember all the things that they need to remember to be. It's just a space in your brain and you got to get there, and you can't just like flip it on like a switch.
No, not easy. Not easy at all.
I don't know, at Drawbridge, yeah, we had daily stand-ups. And I mean, there's a set of things that were effective for that small team to build like this really complicated piece of software really quickly. And I think part of it is that like, as the manager, like I understood everything that everyone was doing and I had them all stack ranked and I could talk to them. So like people, there's like, I'm going to say there's this, we could talk about this. There's this, I use the term like there's sort of cargo cults of Azure. Sometimes people don't like the term cargo cult because it's somewhat misapplied, but take it for what it's meant to mean. There's lots of people who like adopt Agile because they're like, well, this is how we need to do software development. And they don't really understand why each facet exists or what is the purpose of doing this thing. Like, why are the sprints 2 weeks long? Why do we synchronize to put a release, like to make a releasable artifact? And because they don't like really understand the purpose behind each of these things, they can underestimate the fact that each one of them has some bureaucratic weight. They all have cost associated with them. And so that can result in like a overly processed way of doing things that doesn't necessarily fit the problem, depending upon the circumstances. I do think certain things that come from Agile are really valuable. The idea of like focusing on stack ranking priorities as opposed to estimating time, because in software development, you're always trying to solve problems that you don't know the answers to, and consequently, it's hard to estimate how much time it's going to take you to do it if no one's ever done it before, right? And so that's the fundamental challenge. And so if you focus on what is the highest priority, you run at that priority as hard as you can, you're making progress against your requirements in the most efficient way possible. But I think in order to do that, the leader has to have like a real understanding of what's going on in each person's world and like what they're working on and what's challenging about it. So you can't just sort of like be detached from it. You've got to sort of be involved in coaching each person through each task. But if you're able to do that, we had real stand-ups where it's like, look, like this is what I'm doing today. That's it. And if the manager is like mentally like there with that person, then they understand why this is the next thing that they need to do. We didn't need to be in the same room, like I said, except for once every few months when we would design and plan out all these tickets, right, that we would then be executing on over time.
Any tips for people kind of either new to remote or new to managing in a remote world in terms of what tools and process you've used?
Let's say a couple of things. I think that, like I said, I mean, understand what people are doing is the first thing. So, like, if you're too detached from the work that they're actually doing, that's where you don't actually understand what's happening. And so they can give an update like, yeah, I'm still working on this thing. But if you're not like in it with them, if you don't really understand what they're doing, then it'll get to a point where you don't get why it's not progress isn't being made. So you have to sort of like be helping them think through the things they are doing. And I think that, you can get away with these stand-ups. You have to make time for each person, at least once a week. You got to make space for them, like have a 30-minute or an hour with them because you don't have those water cooler conversations. So you can't just sort of like by osmosis, sort of like know what's up or how people are feeling. So you have to deliberately make sure that there's time for them to surface things to you. Another thing is just like be sure that to update each person as well as the team, like about what's going on, like give them lots of context because again, you're compensating for this environment where everyone's not just like in the office every day when they just like by osmosis kind of know what's up and where things are going. And so people can feel disconnected. They can feel, like they don't understand what's happening or they have fears about, things that are going on. So that the more sort of consciously you can make sure that everyone is up to date and that you're updating people about, it's not just them reporting up to you, it's you're reporting to them about the rest of the business and what's happening and why can sort of improve their state. And then, I think one of the coolest things that we were doing during COVID that seems to have like, I haven't seen it as much recently is just sort of like, like having a Zoom based happy hour. Everyone's on a Zoom call and you got your own beverage, but we're all in a different location, but it's like, we're still kind of like just having fun together. I think that is like an important, if you've got a truly remote team, trying to find ways to like hang out with them that we're not here to just do the work can really help people again, like maybe have more empathy for each other. So one of the problems is that when you only interact with somebody in order to get work done, and that can sometimes be frustrating. They can't prioritize what you need, or they have a different perspective. And so, if every interaction you have with them is business, it's easier for you to just sort of like get angry with them if they're not doing what you want or they can't do what you want. And so, if you have more sort of so again, all this stuff has to be deliberate when you're remote. Whereas like if we're all in the office every day, maybe we just kind of hang out together. And so everyone's got some base level understanding of each other. kind of deliberately force, and I think it's best if you can physically get people together at least like once a year. Sometimes it's really hard. Sometimes you got people on the other side of the planet. But you gotta still think about them, the world they're in order to make them effective. And so, yeah, if you can plan ways to have fun, virtually, then that's good. Maybe you can play a video game together virtually or something like that. And of course, I mean, I'm really comfortable with things like Slack. And I think there's maybe almost a generation gap there. I mean, I grew up on IRC, right? And so I'm totally comfortable chatting with people in order to get things done. It's a very effective tool for me. There are some people that don't like it or they're not effective at it. I've seen some leaders like who really like they fear it, right? They don't want all their employees getting together on Slack and like plotting revolution, right? I mean, it can be, I don't, it can be a thing where I don't know how well Slack scales. There are certain behaviors that sort of that creep in when you get to like a bigger scale where there's a lot of politics and there's people are trying to like react to the senior leaders' comments to make to have visibility, and they're doing all these.
You get the performative stuff.
Yes, right? So it's like in small when you're smaller, chat works very effectively, and if you think about it, it's like it is a replacement for the idea that we're all sitting in the same room, right? And we're not all sitting at the same room at the scale of 1,000 people. And so, it may make sense as you scale to, sort of have pockets of Slack where there are like groups of people that work together, where they need space for informal interaction. But thinking about this is not fully refined yet, but I'm not sure that like when you get to, because I haven't been like responsible for the whole community of like at organizations that I've worked that are at that scale of like several thousand. But, it could be the case that like, those online interactions need to be structured differently as you get past like a few hundred employees.
Yeah, I think you still need the small group stuff, but then the how you deal with the larger group, that dynamic has to change.
I think so. Yeah, like, I think you should sort of, like, encourage these small pockets, but then maybe, the larger group is more sort of presentations and you know what I mean? As opposed to, like, we're all chatting together in this chat room.
Absolutely. So you mentioned leading a vulnerability research team. How does that differ from leading developers?
Let me say a couple things. I think that the cool thing about, the vulnerability researchers, and I think it extends sort of to my experience in early stage companies, is that like I was surrounded by like really smart, like highly self-motivated people. And there's different degrees of this. You can be really smart, but not necessarily know what direction to march, if you will. But there's a lot of people who like they like have ideas about what they want to do, right? And the thing about work is that you get a job somewhere and your employer is basically defining for you what you're going to spend your time on, right? And that can be frustrating sometimes for people who have their own vision, their own ideas, right? And so I think that the most important thing that I learned managing vulnerability researchers, there's two things. The first is like, it's just really important to structure their world so that they have some time to drive their own agenda, right? That they have time for their own research projects, independent of the business's priorities, and balancing that, creates an environment where those people are most motivated. And like a lot of I think leadership has to do with figuring out how to put people in a place where they're doing what they love and they're motivated to do it, and they're going to come in and give it 120% because they love it. You know what I mean? Like and you have to be thoughtful about like how to put people in a place where and how to structure their work so that you get that alignment, right? Because that's when you're going to get the most out of that person. And sometimes you have a problem where that person isn't really in the right job for them, right? And how can you get them into a role where it's really what they're born to do, if that makes any sense? And that's particularly important in the context of vulnerability research. So the other thing that I want to talk about is just sort of that I've seen sometimes like junior managers, like when they first get a leadership role, they don't have the same perspective as an old men like me have about the passage of time. And I think that affects, to a certain degree, the way that they think about their people and also the way that they, think about themselves. And so I think there's two facets of this, but the first, I mean, basically what I'm saying is that like the most important thing in business, right, is relationships. Like, I don't think that in the past 25 years, I've ever gotten a job because I put my resume in somewhere and somebody that I didn't know read that resume and said, yeah, this is the guy, right? Like, typically, there's some sort of personal relationship you have with the people, and they really understand your value because they've worked with you before, right? And so that network that you build up over time, like, is almost everything about what you end up doing. And as you become more and more senior, it's not just like your ability to like the network up, like your ability to get a job from somebody, but also your ability to recruit others into the thing that you're trying to build, right? And so if you think about this when you're early, in your career, like all the people that are around you, like 30 years from now, they're going to be in different places, right? But you've worked with them. It's almost like you're alumni of something, right? So like people say the reason that you go to like Harvard Business School is not because of the education that you get. Anybody can read a business book. It's like it's the other students that are also there. And like the fact that they're going to go off and do something and maybe you can do it with them. You know what I'm saying? It's the relationships that you build that are a huge part of the value of like, high-end business degree like that. And I mean, I think that's the same thing any place that you work, like the people that you work with. And I'll say this about internet security systems. There was a really sort of like strong culture in that company. A lot of us liked working together and over the years, there's people remember each other and sort of like find opportunities for each other. And so, that's important to remember when you're in this like initial leadership position that all these people are going to, over the course of decades like move on, and your relationship with them that you build today, maybe it matters 20 years from now. And I think the other thing is just like looking for ways to enable the people that work for you to grow rather than seeing them as who they are today, understanding the potential that they may have, and creating an opportunity to develop that potential because ultimately that makes them more valuable to the organization over time. And like, many managers, like they're just like, they're so focused on like, well, like I have to deliver this thing this quarter. Right. And these people are who they are, and I can use them in this way. And, if I've seen some managers who have this philosophy or this attitude that like, development is their responsibility. If they want to go on the weekend and try to learn more about this stuff, then that's on them. You know what I'm saying? But I think that it's important to try to like cultivate and enrich the people around you and enable them to become more valuable to you, And so, and I think those things are connected because if you enable those people to move in their career, you're helping to enrich this network, which ultimately like you'll continue to be a part of over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. So that I guess that raises an interesting topic, which is, in those environments where you're building that network, one of the things I've observed kind of having the differing effect is like when people leave, how they approach that. Like, if you leave in a, if you leave scorched earth, you're closing off that branch of the network. But if you leave productively, you may find yourself back in the same place, or you may find people following you, or all kinds of crazy things happen.
Well, of course, it depends on who you're scorching earth with, right?
Sure. Sometimes you have to.
So, I mean, the other facet of this is like, don't underestimate the potential for your peers or even the people that you report to grow and change over time. And, that's another thing we tend to, if we have a sort of like short-term horizon viewpoint, we see somebody sort of who doesn't get something or who is, difficult to deal with in some way, but you kind of, take that as a given about that person. Like this person is going to be this way. But it's possible that like, 15 years from now, that person might have matured in ways that like caused them to see things differently, right? And I'm constantly I'm going to talk about this like in computer security, particularly like on the enterprise side. There's this huge like challenge that infosec people face just getting our jobs done, and I think a lot of it comes down to this concept of. Are you familiar with Dunning-Kruger?
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. familiar with it. I like it's amazing. Like I'm surrounded by people who are aware of it, and like so sometimes when I bring it up, people are like, "Oh, I've never heard of that. What is that?" But I think like maybe it's a thing that infosec people know more about than others because we're constantly confronted with people who like their career is in IT. They've spent 20 years doing IT. They've been exposed to computer security over that period of time, and they think they get it, right? They overestimate their understanding, and they're on that curve early on in this place where it's like they think they know what's what, and then they see you, computer security person, show up, and you're like, "Well, we need to do this," and they're like, "No, we don't. We don't need to do that. I know computer security, right?" So you're constantly trying to negotiate with those people, and that's one of the sort of greatest frustrations associated with being an infosec person in enterprise. I think is just the constant sort of need to try to try to convince people to make changes and to improve and to not get frustrated with them. And I think it helps if you keep in mind the possibility for them to grow personally over time. You know what I'm saying? Like, there is this thing where it's like emotional detachment from the bureaucracy is really important when you're working in a larger organization, right? Like your ability to like deal with people that can be frustrating and not take it personally or like or eat it from the standpoint of your soul becomes really really important because otherwise the frustrations of dealing with the obstacles to getting things done can cause you to rage quit, right? So that's how you end up in this place, right? So I really like the research that Carnegie Mellon University has published over the years on insider threat. If you're not familiar with the Common Sense Guide to Mitigating Insider Threats that CMU puts out, it's really good stuff and it's very research driven. And they identify three different classes of insider threats based on real incidents that have been investigated. People who committed crimes in the workplace. And the three most common categories are so first of all, it's like fraud. And typically that person is like a junior person who has like access to sensitive information as a consequence of their jobs. Like they're opening envelopes with credit card statements in them, right? Or checks. And they're getting pressured by someone in their life to like, dip their hand in the cookie jar. And, maybe they're not very wealthy and, they've got a lot of pressure in their lives and they succumb to it and they do it, right? So that's one class. The two other classes, one of them is like somebody who feels this sense of ownership of the work product that they engaged in, and they take it with them when they leave the company, even though they're not supposed to. It's really the company's property. And then the third class is people who just become super disgruntled with their work and they, just destroy things on the way out the door. Like they set up some piece of software that's going to delete a bunch of data when they quit because they're mad, right? One of the stories that's in their book is this guy who like, he gets laid off and he goes out drinking because he's upset that he's laid off, comes back home, really drunk, sits down at his computer. And a lot of people's access control practices, like they're able to pull your access for future authentication, but they don't have the ability to like unwind your existing authentication, right? So he's still logged into this Unix machine at work and, he's in a bad place and he destroyed some data and then, maybe regretted it the next morning, but by then it was done. Right. So, so it's an interesting story because it speaks to like the fact that people do stupid things and also the fact that like you need better access control policies. But, I think the reason I'm talking about all this is because you brought up the situations where people rage quit. And I think that data provides interesting sort of insight into why those things happen. And I think sometimes people come to InfoSec people and they're like, you're the insider threat guys. You need to build technology that will detect, and prevent insider threat. And I'm like, no, no, no. The management team is the insider threat guys. Like that person's boss is responsible for their relationship with the company. And if that relationship is going sideways, it may be that like that person like legitimately like does not like what's going the direction of the organization and like likes their boss. It's not always the bosses that like a consequence of there's this trope where people say people join companies and they quit bosses. And sometimes that's true, but it's not always strictly true. Like it could be that like the relationship with the boss is positive, but the relationship with the organization is sour. But regardless, it is the boss's responsibility to make sure that that person's relationship with both the organization and with them is constructive, right? And to also be cognizant if that's not the case. And by the way, if you're not sort of intentionally making time for that person, then you don't know where they're at, right? So that comes back to my point about like, particularly when you're doing things remotely, you have to decide that there's an hour for this person just to explain what's going on with them and for you to explain the organization. And if you're not doing those things, then that creates this opportunity for mental models to be different, right? I don't know. Another thing I've learned over the years is like if somebody, you do end up with people who like they're not in the right job, right? They're just not. They don't like what they've been asked to do, and you got to figure it out. Like I've definitely had situations where I can tell that they're not being productive, but they're not really telling me the truth about why they're not being productive. They're trying to hide. They know they should be. They're embarrassed. They rationalize it, right? And it turns out that like I've aimed them wrong, right? Or I put them in the wrong chair. I've given them something that is not interesting to them, or they have to do it in a way that it's against the grain of the wood of the human, if that makes sense, right? And so, like in one case, there was a developer that we'd all had a bunch of meetings and we decided we were going to have him write this thing in this particular programming language, and he really hated that programming language, but he didn't surface it, right? He just like was slowly making progress, and he didn't know it, and he wasn't interested in learning it. And this was a context where it really didn't matter. And when I figured it out and I said, why don't you do it in the language of your choice? Because in this case, I don't care. He became like 10 times more productive,
Yeah.
right? It was just like I had created a context for him that was annoying to him, but he was embarrassed to surface it. But sometimes it isn't, I can't fix the problem. It's not that there's a misalignment between you and the situation, and I can reorganize the situation in order to make you productive. You're not in the right place. And, getting to, the most constructive way to offboard somebody is if we mutually agree that this is not for you, right? Like you can see it. We've talked about it, right? Like we've had a discussion about the fact that like this really isn't aligned with what your interests are. And so when I come back a few weeks later and I'm like, look, we got to end this relationship, you're already in that place mentally where you've figured that out, and it's not kind of like a shock to you. I mean, the only time when you end up having to let somebody go where it can be an absolute shock to them is when it's a layoff. And even then, I don't think it should be. Like if you're responsible in terms of like the leadership role, you understand the financial position of the company, you should usually be able to predict that there's like troubled waters ahead, and you're not letting people go right now because you're hoping to figure it out. But if you're conveying the risk to people that they understand what the risk is, then they're less likely to be horrified if it turns out that things didn't work out as planned. But again, like, I don't know, it doesn't always work, right?
Sure. What are the qualities you look for in new hires, and how do you screen for them? Not just the technical. I mean, it's relatively easy to kind of find this person knows how to code or this person can understand a vulnerability. But what are the soft qualities you're looking for?
I mean, first of all, I'm really looking for people that are back to like this idea of people being self-motivated. Like I'm really looking for people who like are, interested in stuff, and like enough to have, sort of have their own projects. They don't have to be something that they would be willing to share with others. But you'd expect somebody who's like really like, and I mean, so part of this comes back to my sort of like early days origin in the infosec world. I remember there was an early DEF CON where they asked the audience, like, how many of you have a college degree? And about 50% said yes. And when I went to college, like there were no computer security classes. Like today, the same school, there's all this, like you could specialize in computer security. There's all kinds of training, right? That didn't exist. And if you were learning about this stuff, even if you did, like if you were getting like sort of like a college education, you were still messing around with this stuff at home, learning, educating yourself, right? And and of course, you could be 100% self-trained and be very effective, especially in the late 90s when everything was new, right? And that's always my advice for early career people. It's like, go learn as much as you can on your own computer in your own time. Make time for yourself on the weekends. But this is what I'm looking for in first of all in people is just this like this self-motivation and this like their own idea about the things that they'd like to create in the world, right? And then the other thing that I'm sort of like looking for is humility. And like there's a lot of prima donna people in technology, right? There's a lot of people who like they have some technical skill and it gets deep in their ego and they know that they're smart, but that becomes a problem in that they're constantly sort of like looking down at others and sort of like in competition with them over whether they're smarter than these other people. And that can become really, really corrosive.
And they often haven't hit the first knee on the Dunning-Kruger curve.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yes, there's that. But I mean, the other thing, I mean, I think personally, like I was kind of an arrogant jerk when I was, 18 years old with respect to my technical skills. And part of the value of for me of my college education is that like I recognized like that I wasn't as smart as I thought I was. Basically, like it was hard, and there were people there that were better at it than me. And sometimes it's useful to go through that experience to see that, and some of us come through, especially for self-trained, like we come through this path that never really puts us in a position where we're really exposed to people that are genuinely like smarter than you are. And I prefer to work in that kind of context. Like if I'm hiring for anything, like that's another this isn't soft. I want to find people who know more than I do. One of the things I was going to talk about is the like there's this you can look it up. There's these 5 kinds of power or 5 sources of power. One of them is expertise. So like because you're a technical person, you're used to being the expert. And so sometimes those technical people become managers, they surround themselves with people who have weaker technical skills because they're trying to maintain that position of authority that comes from expertise, right? And really, if you want to again build powerful organizations, you want to get the smartest people you can find, and so you've got to get people that are smarter than you. At X Force Research, I had a bunch of people working for me who are way smarter than me, and like capable of things that I have been unable to achieve. And like we needed those people, and my job was to create an environment for them to be awesome. You know what I'm saying? So it's a different kind of authority that you need in order to be effective in that kind of function. But that's how you build powerful organizations that can accomplish great things, right? You build them out of the smartest people that you can find. But folks that are really, really smart, but then, sort of like really deep in their ego about it and don't respect others, can be really toxic in an organization. They can create political conflict and, those dynamics, like I think undermine productivity. And so there is a place where someone's soft skills are not worth the price of their hard skills, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So you mentioned like regular one-on-ones. Is there something else that you do as a leader that you wish more leaders would do?
It's like this coupling of 2 things. It's first of all, how do I get this person into a position where they, sort of like are doing the right work? And like a lot of like leaders, like they see the work and they need to get the work done, and the people are there to get the work done. And they're not really trying to understand how to align the people with the work that they're being asked to do. And so like understanding those people and like understanding that you're going to get more out of those people if if they really love what they've been tasked with. And how do you get as close to an alignment of that as possible? And then the second thing is like trying to understand how each person can grow and how you can help them grow, right? Because we're all nobody like at the level of that we're operating at is like really just here to collect a paycheck, right? We all have maybe things we want to do in the world. We all have, sort of like development of our career that we're engaged in, and we all want to feel like we're part of something that's significant. So we want to work someplace where we care about the consequences of what we're building. Like we enjoy being a part of it, and we see a future for ourselves in it, right? And so if you're not sort of like working with that person to understand how they can develop and creating a way within their work for them to develop, you're not really creating a future for that person, that they're invested in. I think that's what I'm talking about. Like, I think that many leaders that I've had, they see, sort of people as like tools in the tool shed, but they fail to sort of like look at the person as part of the product of what they're producing, and thinking about like, how can I, sort of fully utilize and engage that person and develop them.
What's the hardest transition you faced working your way up the ladder?
I would say it's that first management job, right? Because and I mean, there's classic things to say about it. You're so like, when you're an individual contributor, you are responsible for getting the work done. And you are often promoted because you're really good at achieving goals, right? And so you end up in this management role, but you still have this goal orientation, where you want to see the work get done. And you have these people that you delegate the work to who may not be as good as you are at achieving those goals. And it's really hard to sort of like shift your mindset from focusing on achieving the goal to focusing on coaching the person that's there to the point where they achieve the goal. And that again has to do with, sort of like being more invested in the development of that person and the alignment of that person than you are invested in the goal itself. That can be really tough because you have to accept that like things are not going to be done the way that you would have done them. That things are not going to be done, sort of as well or, as quickly as you would have done them. And that the way to improve the situation is not to focus on the goal and figure out how to achieve the goal. It's actually to focus on the people and figure out how to develop them so that the goals get achieved better. And, just that whole mindset shift is really difficult when you're in an organization where you are, you have to deliver, and like your team is graded on its delivery of these goals, right? And so you still feel that personal responsibility to get those things done, but it's like there's a different set of knobs that you turn in order to like get things to happen, and teaching yourself to like use the right set of knobs and not just be like focused on that outcome. I think that as you like move up from your first management role to like more senior management roles, really it's a similar sort of like, coaching and mentoring of the people beneath you. Like it's like, what is that person trying to accomplish, and how can I best enable them? And, how can I like help them think through the things that are challenging to them? You know what I mean? I think those are, and how can I again like help them understand the overall objectives and be aligned to them. Those are the things you end up doing. And I don't see as much difference in terms of the people management as you like sort of move up. I think that like the strategic problems that you end up working on are more complicated, I think at more senior levels.
That's good. All right. Unfortunately, that's all the time we've got for today. Before we wrap it up, if people want to follow along with your work, where's the best place to go?
Well, I suppose you can follow me on LinkedIn. I don't know how to get them the URL, but if you search for Tom Cross and GetReal, you'll probably find me there.
Sounds good. Awesome. It's been a great conversation. Thanks for taking the time, Tom.
Well, thanks for having me on the podcast. This has been very interesting, and I think these are important discussions to have.